Imagine that you're a little kid growing up in 1938. The Great Depression is coming into its 9th year, and the entire world seems to be cast in a grayish hue. Gray is the color that permeates everything in America. Gray is the color of the oatmeal you eat every day for breakfast because your family can afford nothing else. Gray is the color of your father's newspaper, the one that declares that the economy is not getting any better. And gray is the color on the face of every person that you know, a face that is tired and frustrated and stressed. One day you enter your local general store clutching the dime that you have struggled to save. You spot it instantly because your eye is drawn to its brightly colored cover. Sitting on a magazine rack, surrounded by magazines as gray as the rest of the world around you, is Action Comics #1. On its cover, in full color, is the drawing of a man lifting a car, with a great big S emblazoned on his chest. You buy the magazine immediately and are soon enraptured in the exploits of Superman as he battles the forces of evil in the world. As you sit reading your magazine, you are blissfully unaware of the impact that little magazine will have on the culture around you. The advent of Action Comics #1 marks the birth of the legitimate American mythology. This scenario occurred in America's past and is a situation wherein the importance of having an unambiguous national identity is extremely important. When a culture's beliefs and customs are thrown into turmoil, a culture must have a strong foundation for people to fall back on. In the early 20th century, the American identity was in great turmoil. The United States was coming out of both the Great Depression and World War I and were fearful of another catastrophic conflict in the future. In the not-so-distant past, the United States had finally expanded across the continent, and there were no more obvious challenges to conquer. Americans began searching for their next national identity, something to identify them moving forward, but were at a loss because they possessed no Arthurian legend. When discussing any mythology, it is extremely important to look at its historical context. No one knows for sure when the first myth was told, but it is safe to assume that as long as there have been human beings, there has been myth. The first recorded myths were Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, but the Greeks are not alone in possessing a mythology. Every culture has one of their own, from the complex system of the ancient Egyptians to the naturalistic myths of the Native Americans. The achievements of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table provide a source for England's views on chivalry, the proper function of government, and the rather British predisposition towards round furniture, while Robin Hood and his band of merry men provide a sense for British honor, justice, and aversion to tyranny. Superman, the original superhero, was published in 1938, and his popularity is what has allowed the superhero genre to soar. Other well-known superheroes include Batman to Spider-Man, the X-Men to the Avengers, the Justice League to even Aquaman himself. But there are two superheroes who are especially important for the way that their storylines clearly demonstrate superheroes' mythology: Wonder Woman from DC Comics and the Invisible Woman of the Fantastic Four, both of whom I will get into later. What I am arguing in this presentation is that myths are stories which reflect the values and ideals of the culture from which they arrive from, and since superheroes are myths according to this definition, understanding them as such serves to further define the American identity. There are some who would propose, however, that superheroes are simply colorful characters invented by the dying comic book industry to make a few bucks. However, superheroes clearly meet the criteria for the complex mixture of stories which serve to clearly show a society's moral and political values. But if we accept superheroes as the American myth, what is to be gained from this perspective? The answer is that a clear and well-defined mythology is one of the most important components for any society to be healthy and flourishing. According to William J. Doughty's A Comprehensive Definition of Myth, myths may fit several classifications simultaneously, belonging for instance to collective, natural, and etymological classes depending upon the function of the myth in society or upon external distinctions made by the analyst. While all three distinctions are important, we will be mainly focused on collective myths, which explain the ethos of the culture or the motivation for their actions. The ethos of a culture is its myths, but this is not something that we can discover by simply reading about a culture's history. After all, once a society is passed along, How is one to paint an accurate portrait of that society? The answer is by studying their myth. The benefit of myth over history is that it forces us as individuals to try and answer the questions which are relevant to our society. They seek to convince the audience of their relevance by leading them to participate in their culture, causing them to discover their individual identity within the context of their society. Instead of denying those things which are inexplicable, which cannot be examined or proven mathematically, they accept that they do indeed have a powerful reality, gestured to by means of narrative form, the only appropriate form for dealing with mystery. Myths clearly play a unique and meaningful role in how a society's identity is constructed. Without one, a culture cannot hope to achieve their greatest potential. Since America's founding, there have been several contenders for the American myth, the most notable being the tall tales of the early 19th century. However, these did not catch on quite like the superheroes of the early 20th century, who remain embedded in the American consciousness and continue to provide the American identity. As I mentioned earlier, Wonder Woman and the Invisible Woman are both characters whose storylines clearly demonstrate the American ethos. Superhero myths have long revealed the major shift in how Americans have viewed the roles of women. Wonder Woman at DC Comics has been a substantial character since her debut in 1942. Her storyline provided people during the Second World War with a way of comprehending the sudden influx of women into previously male-dominated workforces. Wonder Woman, alias Diana Price, served as an Army nurse and later as an Air Force secretary. It made sense. After all, if Wonder Woman could serve as a nurse and kick the bad guy's butt in her spare time, why couldn't one's own mother do something similar? For millions, Wonder Woman's role provided a way of clearly seeing and dealing with the shift in cultural perspective. The Invisible Woman of the Fantastic Four has also had an interesting development. At the inception of the Fantastic Four, Susan Richards often served as little more than a plot device, fulfilling a sort of damsel in distress role. However, she soon became a much more influential member of the team as she became more confident and assertive in her abilities. Today, she is widely considered to be one of the most powerful figures in the Marvel Universe. Susan Richards also embodies another characteristic that Americans hold dear: the woman who can do it all. In American society, women are often expected to maintain fulfilling careers, raise well-behaved and well-adjusted children, and maintain solid relationships with their partners. Whether or not this is actually possible, and recent studies seem to indicate that it is not, women still struggle to achieve this balance. Richards is no exception. She balances her roles as wife, mother, and superhero with a considerable lack of ease, not unlike most women who find themselves in similar situations. Mythology clearly reveals the spirit and ethos of the culture from which it originates. As seen through the storylines of Wonder Woman and the Invisible Woman, and the ways in which the roles of women have grown and changed, superhero narratives clearly meet this tenet of mythology. In 1938, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were forced to sign away their creative rights to Superman. This signing away of rights has come to be known as one of the most infamous in American commerce. In the 21st century, comic book companies are major corporations with net worths in the billions of dollars. In contrast, superhero myths were created during the Great Depression, when out-of-work pulp fiction authors began searching for a new cast of characters to write and illustrate about. Many people would look at this and say that it is impossible for superheroes to be myth due to the consumerist culture surrounding them. However, I would argue that simply because something has a consumerist culture around it does not prevent it from being myth. In fact, many of what we call ancient myths today actually do have strong consumerist ties. Take, for example, Virgil's Aeneid, which was written during the reign of Augustus Caesar and serves in many ways as a sort of propaganda for his political agenda. The myth of Aeneas clearly also demonstrates Augustus's attempts to bring about a new era of peace and prosperity in Rome, mainly through the reintroduction of Roman morals and virtues. In many ways, the propaganda in the Aeneid contributes to its greatness rather than detracts from it. In fact, I would posit that if myths are certainly a reflection of the society they come from, then the consumerist culture is what drives the American myth, since consumers will only participate in those things which reflect their values. A myth is a story which conveys the moral and political views of the society from which it originates. It provides a sense of stability for a culture because it provides a method by which an individual can participate in their society as a whole. Furthermore, superheroes, like all mythology, reveal the ethos of the American culture. Critics of this view, however, would argue that due to the consumerist culture surrounding superheroes, it makes it unlikely that they could be myth. However, like Virgil's Aeneid, simply having a consumerist culture surrounding it does not prevent something from being a myth. When Americans are faced with a situation in which they are forced to question everything that they believe in, what can they turn to know who they are as a culture? Like all great mythologies before it, American superheroes have sought to provide Americans with a way of answering the questions that are relevant to them. And like Virgil's Aeneid, myths can be deepened, and so as a society, we should seek to create a better superhero story. If American culture wishes to grow and develop in the same way that the ancients did, we must accept superheroes as the American myth, because failure to do so will result in a culture that is incomplete and whose growth is significantly stunted. Thank you.